Close your eyes for a second. Picture King David. What do you see? A pale-skinned European warrior with flowing blonde hair? A Renaissance prince in royal robes? Yeah, that's what they wanted you to see. But here's the thing nobody tells you. Every single painting you've ever seen of King David is a lie. The man who killed Goliath, the shepherd who became Israel's greatest king, the ancestor of the Messiah himself, he didn't look anything like those paintings. And the reason why is about to blow your mind. Because hidden in the pages of the Bible itself, buried in genealogies that pastors skip over, concealed in family trees that scholars avoid discussing, there's an undeniable truth. King David carried African blood. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. His grandmother was African. His great-great-grandmother was African. The women who carried the royal bloodline into his veins came from the same lands, the same peoples, the same ancestry as the continent of Africa. And for 2,000 years, the most powerful institutions in the world have worked overtime to make sure you never knew that. They whitewashed the paintings, they rewrote the history books, they created an entire false image of what ancient Israel really looked like. Why? Because if people knew the truth about David's bloodline, it would shatter everything they've been taught about race, about power, about who gets to claim the legacy of the Bible itself. Tonight, we're going deep. We're pulling back the curtain on one of history's greatest cover-ups. We're going to trace the family tree they never showed you in Sunday school. And by the end of this video, you'll never look at the Bible the same way again. Are you ready? Because this is the story they never wanted you to hear. Let's start with a simple question. Why do all those famous paintings show David as a white European? The answer isn't religious, it's political. Starting in the 13th century, European artists began recreating biblical figures in their own image. It wasn't an accident, it was intentional. Renaissance painters, working under the patronage of kings and the Vatican, transformed Middle Eastern historical figures into pale-skinned Europeans. Why? Control. Think about it. If you're a European monarch in the 1400s claiming divine right to rule, what do you need? You need the heroes of the Bible to look like you. You need Moses, David, Solomon, all of them, to reflect your image. Because if they look like you, then you can claim their authority, their legitimacy, their divine mandate. This wasn't just about art, this was about power. The royal families of Europe used biblical imagery to justify their rule. They commissioned paintings, sculptures, tapestries, stained glass windows, all depicting biblical kings as European royalty. It became so widespread that by the 1600s, nobody even questioned it anymore. But here's where it gets darker. When you erase someone's African ancestry, you're not just changing their skin color in a painting, you're erasing their actual heritage. You're removing their connection to an entire continent. You're stealing their identity and replacing it with a lie. And this lie had consequences. Because if David, the greatest king of Israel, the man after God's own heart, carried African blood, then so did his descendants, including, according to Christian tradition, Jesus himself. That's a problem for people who built empires on the belief that Europeans were superior. That's a problem for institutions that justified slavery by claiming Africans were cursed. That's a problem for anyone who wanted to use the Bible to prove that white people were God's chosen rulers. So they buried it. They painted over it. They created an alternate history so convincing that even today, 2,000 years later, most people have no idea what King David actually looked like. But the evidence? It's still there, hidden in plain sight, in the genealogies, in the archaeology, in the DNA. And we're about to uncover all of it. All right, let's get into the family tree, because this is where it gets really interesting. The Bible actually tells us exactly who David's ancestors were. It's right there in the book of Ruth and the Gospel of Matthew. But here's the thing, Most people never actually read these genealogies carefully, and the few who do, well, they tend to gloss over the parts that don't fit their narrative. Let's start with David's grandmother, Ruth the Moabite. You've probably heard of her, right? The loyal daughter-in-law who followed Naomi back to Israel? Beautiful story. What they don't emphasize is the part where the Bible explicitly calls her a Moabite, over and over again. Ruth the Moabite. Not just Ruth, Ruth the Moabite. Why does that matter? Because Moab wasn't in Europe. It was a kingdom located in what's now Jordan, directly east of the Dead Sea. And the Moabites, they were an Afro-Asiatic people with deep connections to northeastern Africa. Now, I know what you're thinking. Okay, but Jordan is in the Middle East, not Africa, right? True, but here's what modern anthropology and archaeology tell us. The ancient Near East wasn't divided the way we think of it today. There was constant migration, trade, and intermarriage between northeastern Africa and the Levant. The Moabites, like many peoples in that region, had significant African ancestry. Studies of ancient Moabite remains show cranial features consistent with Afro-Saharan populations. Their pottery styles match North African patterns. Their language belongs to the Afro-Asiatic family, the same linguistic family that includes ancient Egyptian and Cushitic languages. In other words, Ruth wasn't European. She wasn't even what we'd call Middle Eastern in the modern sense. She was an Afro-Levantine woman, and she's David's grandmother. But it doesn't stop there. Rahab the Canaanite. Go further back in David's family tree, and you'll find Rahab, the woman who helped the Israelite spies in Jericho. According to the Gospel of Matthew, she's also David's ancestor. And Rahab was a Canaanite. Now, the Canaanites have been heavily studied by archaeologists, and here's what we know. Ancient Canaan was a melting pot. It sat at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe. And archaeological evidence shows significant African influence throughout ancient Canaanite culture. Recent DNA studies from burial sites in ancient Canaan show genetic markers consistent with northeastern African populations. Trade records show extensive contact with Nubian kingdoms to the south. Artistic depictions on Canaanite pottery show dark-skinned figures with African features. The Canaanites weren't a monolithic white civilization. They were a diverse people, and a significant portion of them had African roots. Rahab was one of those people, and she's in David's bloodline. But wait, there's more. Tamar. Even further back, we find Tamar. Her story is complicated, but genealogically, she's a direct ancestor of David through Judah's line. And who was Tamar? The text describes her as connected to local Levantine tribes. And here's where recent archaeology gets really fascinating. Excavations at ancient sites like Jericho and Lachish have uncovered evidence that the Levant during the Bronze Age had significant populations of dark-skinned Afro-Levantine peoples. DNA extracted from teeth and bones at these sites shows genetic markers linking these populations to northeastern and eastern Africa. We're talking about the same people who would later become part of the tribes of Israel. So let's pause and add this up. David's great-great-grandmother? African ancestry. David's grandmother? Definitely African ancestry. Multiple women in the royal lineage? Afro-Levantine heritage. This isn't speculation. This isn't theory. This is what the Bible itself documents if you actually read it carefully. King David's bloodline wasn't pure Israelite. It was mixed, blended, Afro-Levantine. And that changes everything. Because if David carried African blood, then the entire royal line of Judah carried African blood. The House of David, the dynasty that Christians believe leads directly to the Messiah, was never purely Middle Eastern, and it certainly wasn't European. It was African. Now here's the question nobody wants to ask. If this is right there in the Bible, why doesn't anyone teach it? Drop a comment below if this is the first time you've ever heard this, because I guarantee you're not alone. Okay, so we've got the genealogies, But maybe you're still skeptical. Maybe you're thinking, this is just interpretation. Where's the hard evidence? Fair question. Let's talk archaeology. Because in the last 30 years, archaeologists working in Israel and Jordan have uncovered evidence that completely contradicts the European image of ancient Judah. Let's start with the Tel Dan inscription. In 1993, archaeologists found a stone fragment at Tel Dan in northern Israel. Carved into it, in ancient Aramaic, are the words House of David. It's one of the earliest non-biblical references to King David's dynasty. But here's what's interesting. The archaeological context around that inscription tells us a lot about what the people of that time and place actually looked like. The pottery styles found at the site match North African and Nubian patterns. The metallurgy techniques show influence from Kushite kingdoms to the south. Even the architectural styles have parallels with ancient Sudanese construction methods. This wasn't a European civilization, not even close. Let's go deeper. Excavations in the city of David, the original fortress that King David conquered and made his capital, have uncovered thousands of artifacts. And many of them tell a very different story than the one you learned in church. Seal impressions, tiny clay stamps used to mark documents, show faces with broad noses and full lips. Hair depicted in tight curls or locks. Features that archaeologists describe as Afro-Levantine. Jewelry discovered in Judite tombs show design patterns that match those found in ancient Nubia and Sudan. We're talking about the same bead styles, the same metalworking techniques, the same aesthetic preferences. And then there's the DNA. In recent years, genetic studies of ancient remains from the southern Levant have revealed something fascinating. The people who lived in Judah during David's time had significant genetic overlap with populations from northeastern Africa. A 2020 study analyzing remains from Iron Age Judah found markers consistent with East African and North African ancestry. These weren't outliers. This was the general population. Now, does this mean everyone in ancient Judah was dark-skinned? No, the region was diverse. There was mixing between different populations. But what it does mean is that the idea of ancient Israelites as pale-skinned Europeans is completely false. The average person in King David's kingdom would have had brown or dark brown skin, Afro-Levantine features, hair textures ranging from wavy to tightly coiled. And here's something else they don't teach you. Ancient Judite art. Wall paintings and pottery from the period show human figures with dark skin tones. Not occasionally, regularly. It was the norm, not the exception. One particularly fascinating find comes from Lachish, a major Judite city. Excavations there uncovered pottery fragments showing daily life scenes, and in those scenes, dark-skinned figures. Women with African hairstyles, men with features that look nothing like the European depictions we're used to. But wait, there's more. Remember those Assyrian reliefs showing the conquest of Judite cities? The Assyrians loved to depict their conquered enemies in detailed carvings. And when they carved the people of Judah, they showed them with darker skin, broader features, and tight curly hair. Now, you might say, well, that's just how the Assyrians drew everyone. Nope. Compare those reliefs to how the Assyrians depicted other peoples. They showed distinct differences. And the Judites, they're depicted with clearly Afro-Levantine features. So let's be clear about what the archaeology is telling us. The kingdom of Judah in David's time was not European. The people were not white. The culture had strong connections to northeastern Africa. The genetics show African ancestry. The art shows African features. Everything, and I mean everything, points to one conclusion. The real King David looked nothing like the paintings in your church. He would have had brown skin, probably dark brown. His hair would have been black and curly, possibly styled in locks. His features would have been what anthropologists call Afro-Levantine, a blend of African and Near Eastern characteristics. And that's not a theory. That's what the evidence shows. So why don't textbooks teach this? Why don't documentaries show this? Why don't museums still display European-looking models of ancient Israelites? Good question, and the answer is going to make you angry. Here's the uncomfortable reality. The erasure of African ancestry from King David's lineage wasn't an accident. It was systematic, deliberate, and it happened for very specific political reasons. Let's go back to the 19th century. This was the height of European colonialism. European powers were carving up Africa, enslaving its people, and justifying it all with racial pseudoscience. And one of the ways they justified it was by claiming that Africans had no significant role in biblical history. If you could prove that the heroes of the Bible were European, or at least non-African, then you could argue that God favored white people, that Europeans were the chosen ones, that colonialism was divinely ordained. Sounds insane, right? But this was mainstream academic thinking in the 1800s. Scholars went back through historical records and systematically reinterpreted anything that suggested African involvement in biblical history. They downplayed Egypt's role. They ignored Nubian connections. They erased the obvious African ancestry of key biblical figures. And it worked. By the early 20th century, the standard interpretation of biblical history had become completely Europeanized. Textbooks taught that ancient Israel was a Caucasian civilization. Museums displayed models of ancient Israelites with pale skin and European features. Hollywood cast white actors to play biblical characters. But here's the thing. This wasn't based on evidence. It was based on ideology. And that ideology was supported by powerful institutions. The Vatican, for centuries, had commissioned Renaissance artwork depicting biblical figures as Europeans. Those images became iconic. Changing them would mean admitting that the Church had been wrong for hundreds of years. European royal families had built their legitimacy on claims of descent from biblical kings. If those kings turned out to be African, that undermined their entire claim to power. And then there's modern political Zionism. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, as the movement to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine gained momentum, European Jewish leaders needed to present themselves as the true heirs of ancient Israel. If ancient Israelites looked African, that complicated the narrative, because many of the people already living in Palestine had African ancestry. It became politically advantageous to emphasize European Jewish identity and downplay the African connections of ancient Israelites. I want to be clear, this isn't about criticizing any particular group or religion. This is about understanding how politics shaped historical interpretation. The truth is, multiple groups had reasons to hide or downplay the African ancestry in King David's lineage. European Christians wanted biblical heroes to look like them. Colonial powers wanted to justify their domination of Africa. Racial ideologists wanted to prove white superiority. And academic institutions, often funded by these same power structures, went along with it. They didn't falsify evidence, they just ignored it, or reinterpreted it, or dismissed it as inconclusive. When archaeologists found African-style jewelry in Judahite tombs, trade goods. When DNA studies showed African genetic markers, migration patterns. When ancient art depicted dark-skinned Israelites, artistic convention. There was always an explanation that avoided the obvious conclusion. But here's what they couldn't erase: the Bible itself. Because no matter how many paintings they commissioned, no matter how many textbooks they wrote, they couldn't change the actual text of Scripture. Ruth the Moabite is still Ruth the Moabite. Rahab the Canaanite is still Rahab the Canaanite. The genealogy is right there, in black and white, or should I say, in black and brown. And now, in the 21st century, with new archaeological methods, with DNA analysis, with African scholars finally getting a voice in these discussions, the truth is coming out. The cover-up is crumbling, and it's about time. Drop a comment if you think this should be taught in schools, because right now, it's not, and that needs to change. So let's paint the real picture. Based on everything we now know from archaeology, anthropology, and genetics, what did the average person in King David's kingdom actually look like? First, skin tone. The ancient Levant sits at a latitude similar to northern Africa. The sun is intense. People spent most of their time outdoors. Farmers, shepherds, soldiers, everyone was exposed to constant sunlight. Based on analysis of ancient remains and artistic depictions, the majority of people in ancient Judah would have had skin tones ranging from olive brown to dark brown, not pale, not white, brown. David himself, described in the Bible as ruddy, that word in Hebrew is admoni. Some translate it as reddish or reddish-brown, not pale pink, reddish-brown, the kind of complexion you see in northeastern African populations. Now let's talk about hair. Ancient Israelite law had very specific rules about hair. Nazirites couldn't cut their hair. Priests had regulations about grooming. And archaeological evidence shows that many Judahites wore their hair in locks or braided styles. Sound familiar? These are the same hairstyles found throughout ancient Africa. Dreadlock-style hair appears in Egyptian art, Nubian sculptures, and Kushite depictions. It was a common style throughout the Afro-Asiatic world. So, when you picture young David, the shepherd boy, out in the fields of Bethlehem, picture dark, tightly coiled hair, possibly in locks, not flowing blonde pearls. Facial features? Ancient seals and artwork from Judah show faces with broad noses, full lips, and strong brows. These aren't European features, they're Afro-Levantine features. A 2019 anthropological study analyzing skeletal remains from Iron Age Judah found cranial measurements consistent with northeastern African populations. The researchers concluded that ancient Judahites had significant morphological overlap with ancient Kushite and Egyptian populations. In plain English, they looked more like Ethiopians and Sudanese than like Europeans. And clothing? Archaeological finds show that Judahite clothing styles had more in common with African and Arabian dress than with European clothing. Flowing robes, head coverings, leather sandals, styles still seen throughout Africa and the Middle East today. So here's the real image of King David. A man of about 5'7" or 5'8", average height for that time and place. Dark brown skin, weathered from years in the sun. Black, tightly curled hair, possibly styled in locks. Broad-nosed, full-lipped, muscular from years of shepherding and warfare. Not a European prince in a velvet robe, a Middle Eastern African warrior king. And his people? They looked like him. When David danced before the Ark of the Covenant, it was an Afro-Levantine man celebrating his God. When David wrote the Psalms, they came from the mind of a man with African ancestry. When David established his kingdom, it was built by brown-skinned Afro-Levantine people. This isn't about taking anything away from anyone. It's about telling the truth. The kingdom of Judah was an African-influenced civilization. Its greatest king carried African blood. And its legacy belongs to everyone, but especially to those whose ancestors were erased from the story. Because if we're going to tell history, let's tell the whole story. Let's tell the truth. Now, here's where this gets even deeper. According to the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus was a direct descendant of King David. The genealogy is traced explicitly, David to Solomon, Solomon to Rehoboam, all the way down through the kings of Judah, eventually leading to Joseph, Jesus' legal father. Luke's Gospel traces a similar line, going back through David to Abraham. So if David carried African ancestry, then so did his descendants, all of them, including, according to Christian tradition, Jesus. Now, I'm not going to get into theological debates here. That's not the point. The point is genealogical. If you accept the biblical genealogies as presented, then you have to accept that the bloodline contains African ancestry. It's not optional. It's right there in the text. Ruth the Moabite's blood flows through the generations. Rahab the Canaanite's heritage continues down the line. The Afro-Levantine ancestry of ancient Judah doesn't disappear just because it makes people uncomfortable. blood doesn't lie. And here's what's fascinating. Early Christian art from Africa, from Ethiopia, from Egypt, from Nubia, they depicted Jesus with African features, dark skin, curly black hair, features that reflected their own populations. Were they wrong, or were they actually closer to the historical truth than the European paintings that came later? Think about it. Jesus was born in Bethlehem. He grew up in Nazareth. He lived his entire life in the Levant. He was a descendant of Judah's royal line, and that line, as we've now established, carried significant African ancestry. The idea that Jesus was pale-skinned with straight brown hair, that's not historical. That's Renaissance fan fiction. The real Jesus would have looked like a man from the ancient Levant, brown skin, Afro-Levantine features, a son of David's house. And David's house, as we now know, was an Afro-Levantine house. This isn't controversial. This is just facts. But it's facts that challenge 2,000 years of European artistic tradition. And that's exactly why it matters. So let's bring this all home. King David was not the European king you saw in paintings. He was not pale-skinned. He did not have blonde hair. He did not look like a Renaissance prince or a Hollywood actor. He was an Afro-Levantine warrior king, a man with African ancestry flowing through his veins, a descendant of Moabite, Canaanite, and Levantine peoples who had deep connections to the African continent. And they never taught you this because it changes everything. It changes how we understand biblical history. It changes who gets to claim that legacy. It changes the entire narrative about race, power, and divine favor that European institutions built over the last 1,000 years. If the greatest king of Israel carried African blood, then the story of the Bible has always been a black story too. Not just, but too. It's an African story, a Middle Eastern story, a human story, and that's what makes it so powerful. Because when you erase someone's ancestry, you're not just changing their skin color in a painting. You're stealing their history. You're denying their heritage. You're telling them they don't belong in the story that's rightfully theirs. But the truth? The truth can't be erased forever. It's in the genealogies they skip over. It's in the archaeology they ignore. It's in the DNA that doesn't lie. King David carried African blood. That's not a theory. That's not speculation. That's what the evidence shows when you actually look at it without bias. And if that bothers you, if that makes you uncomfortable, ask yourself why. Because the truth is the truth, whether it fits your worldview or not. Now here's my challenge to you. Share this video. Because the world was never supposed to know this. The institutions that control the narrative don't want this information spreading. They want you to keep believing the lie. But you know better now. You've seen the evidence. You've heard the genealogy. You understand the cover-up. So what are you going to do with this knowledge? Are you going to stay silent, or are you going to be part of revealing one of history's greatest hidden truths? Drop a comment, tell me what you think, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because this is the story they never wanted you to know. And it's time everyone heard it.